The morning Evelyn Hartley's father sold her son, he did it over breakfast. He sat at the head of the long oak table, cutting his eggs with the same unhurried precision he used to cut business deals, and he said it the way a man might announce a change in the weather. The boy is gone. You'll sign the papers today, or I'll make sure Caleb Whitmore never works another day of his life, in this territory or any other. Evelyn's fork hit the plate. Her hands were shaking so hard the silverware rattled. He's my son. Her father looked up at her then, just once, with eyes that had never once held anything she could call warmth. He was your mistake. Now he's been corrected. She lunged across the table. She wasn't a violent woman, had never raised a hand to anyone in her 23 years, but something cracked open in her chest that morning, something that had been sealed shut for too long, and her fingers found his collar before her mind caught up with what her body was doing. The servants pulled her away. Her father straightened his jacket. He didn't even raise his voice. "Lock her room," he said. "She'll calm down." She didn't calm down for 4 years. If you've ever loved someone and been forced to walk away, not because you wanted to, but because someone with more power than you decided they had the right to rewrite your story, then stay with me. Because what happened to Evelyn Hartley is the kind of thing that hollows a person out from the inside. And what she did about it is the kind of thing that fills them back up again. Before we go any further, if this is your first time on this channel, I want to invite you to hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. Every week we bring you tales of courage, heartbreak, and the kind of love that refuses to die quietly. Hit the like button too, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now let's go back to Montana. Let's go back to 1892. Let's go back to the woman in the torn wedding dress standing alone on a platform in the frozen dark, with nothing left to lose and one impossible thing left to find. Watek. The train had been running 4 hours late out of Billings, which meant Evelyn arrived at Coldwater Creek Station at 11:30 on a Wednesday night in January, when the temperature had dropped low enough to make the air feel like something solid pressing against your face. She stepped off the last car and stood on the platform, and for a moment she couldn't move. Not because of the cold, though the cold was brutal, because she had spent the last 3 days on that train telling herself that when she finally got off, she would know what to do next. She had rehearsed it in her head 100 times, the walk into town, the questions she would ask, the name she would say out loud for the first time in years. Caleb Whitmore. Noah. But standing there in the dark with the train groaning away behind her and the platform light cutting a weak yellow circle in the snow, the rehearsed version of herself refused to show up. What showed up instead was the version that hadn't slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 3 days. The version that had eaten half a biscuit and a cup of cold coffee somewhere around Miles City and called it a meal. The version wearing a dress that had once been white and was now gray at the hem and split along the left seam of the bodice where she'd caught it on a nail, climbing out of a second-story window in the middle of the night 6 days ago. She was aware of how she looked. She'd caught her reflection in the train window somewhere over the Yellowstone River and had not looked again after that. She picked up her bag. One bag, canvas, handles worn thin, packed in 4 minutes by lamplight, and walked toward the station house. The man inside behind the counter was somewhere in his 60s, built like he'd spent decades outdoors and hadn't quite stopped yet, with a gray beard and the kind of squint that came from years of reading small print in poor light. He looked up when she came in, and she watched his expression do the thing she'd been watching expressions do since she got on the train in Billings. That quick inventory, that calculation, landing on trouble before she'd opened her mouth. "Station's closed for the night," he said. "I'm not looking for a ticket," Evelyn said. "I'm looking for someone. Caleb Whitmore. He runs a ranch somewhere near here. Or he did, 4 years ago. I need to know if he's still in the area." The man stared at her. "You family of his?" "No." "You a friend?" She hesitated just a half-second too long. "I knew him, years ago." Something shifted in his face, not exactly suspicion, something more like recognition of a category. Woman showing up alone at midnight asking after a single man. He'd seen that category before, and whatever conclusions he'd drawn from it in the past, they weren't generous ones. "Whitmore's out on the Broken Bow spread," he said slowly, "about 9 miles northeast. But you're not going to find anyone willing to take you out there tonight." "I'm not asking to go tonight," she said. I'm asking where I can find a room until morning. Another long look. His eyes dropped to her bag, her dress, came back up to her face. May Sutton takes in boarders. 2 blocks north, yellow door. But she's particular about who she lets stay. Thank you, Evelyn said, and turned for the door before he could say anything else. She felt his eyes on her back the entire way out. May Sutton was particular. She was also awake at midnight, which Evelyn had not expected, and she answered the door in a quilted robe with a lamp in one hand and a look on her face like she'd been waiting for exactly this kind of interruption. She was a small woman, compact, somewhere north of 60, with silver hair pinned back and the kind of face that had started out pretty and evolved into something better, sharper, more interesting, engraved by weather and whatever life had thrown at it. She looked at Evelyn for a long moment. "You're cold," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am." "That dress is ruined." "I know." "You have money for a room?" Evelyn reached into her bag and produced the last of what she'd managed to take from the house in Denver, $7.40. She held it out where the woman could see it. May looked at the money, then at Evelyn's face, then at the money again. She stepped back from the door. "Come in," she said. "I'll put water on." Boom. The room was small and clean and had a quilt on the bed that smelled like cedar. May brought hot water and a plate of cold cornbread without being asked, and she sat in the chair by the window while Evelyn drank the tea and didn't ask a single question, which was either the most merciful thing anyone had done for Evelyn in years, or a patience being saved for later. Evelyn wasn't sure which. "You know Caleb Whitmore?" Evelyn asked after the tea was half gone and some of the shaking in her hands had stopped. "Know of him," May said carefully. "Ranch is northeast of town. Does all right for himself. Keeps to himself mostly. Has a boy." Evelyn's cup stopped halfway to her mouth. "A boy," she said. "Noah. Let's see. He'd be about 4 now. Maybe 5. 4 or 5. She did the math without meaning to. The numbers landed in her chest like stones dropped in still water. "What's he like?" she asked. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. May looked at her. Really looked at her, the way the station man hadn't. Not with suspicion, but with the kind of attention that felt like someone actually trying to understand what they were seeing. "He's a serious little thing," May said after a moment. "Doesn't talk much. Big dark eyes. He comes into town sometimes with his father on supply runs. Stares at everything like he's trying to memorize it." She paused. "Why?" Evelyn set down her cup. She looked at the quilt on the bed, at the pattern of it. Small squares of blue and brown and faded red, stitched together in a repeating shape she didn't know the name of. "He's mine," she said. The silence in the room was complete. May didn't gasp, didn't recoil. She sat very still in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and when she spoke, her voice was even. "You'd better get some sleep," she said. "Whatever you're planning to do, you'll do it better in the morning." Evelyn didn't sleep. She lay in the dark under the cedar quilt and stared at the ceiling and thought about the last time she'd held Noah. He'd been 11 days old. She'd named him herself, over her father's objections, in the 4 hours between his birth and the moment her father arrived at the house and began making arrangements. She remembered the weight of him, the specific gravity of that small body against her chest, the way he'd made a sound when they took him, not a cry, more like a question. She had not answered it. She hadn't been able to. She had told herself in the years since that he was better off, that Caleb was a good man and would raise him well. She had told herself a lot of things in those years, the way you tell yourself things when the alternative is not surviving. But lying in that cold room in Coldwater Creek, Montana, she understood that she had never once believed any of it. She got up at 5, when the dark outside had started to thin. She put on the same dress because it was the only one she had. She folded the quilt and left the $2 on top of it, which was more than May had asked for, and she went downstairs quietly. May was already in the kitchen, already had coffee on. She looked at Evelyn without surprise, poured a cup and set it on the table. "The supply wagon goes out to the Broken Bow spread on Thursdays," May said. "That's today. Hector Muniz drives it. He leaves the feed store at 7. Evelyn wrapped her hands around the cup. "You don't know what I did? Why I left? You don't know anything about me." "No," May agreed. "I don't. But I know what a woman looks like who's been carrying something for too long." She sat down across from her. And I know what it looks like when she's finally decided to put it down. Hector Muniz was a big man, unhurried, with enormous hands and a pleasant face that gave away almost nothing. He looked at Evelyn when she came to the feed store asking about a ride, looked at her dress, looked at her bag and said, "I've got a room. It's cold, though." "I've been cold," she said. He nodded like that was a sufficient answer and went back to loading the wagon. She climbed up on the bench and sat with her hands in her lap and her bag between her feet while he finished loading, and when he climbed up and clicked to the horses, she watched Coldwater Creek fall away behind them, the small cluster of board-front buildings, the church steeple, the smoke from May's chimney rising straight up in the still air. She did not let herself think about what she was going to say. Thinking about it was worse than not thinking about it. She had learned that somewhere around Kansas City, somewhere around the third or fourth rehearsal of a conversation she'd been practicing for 4 years, the road out to the Broken Bow spread was not a road so much as a track, two parallel ruts in the snow with frozen grass between them, running out across open ground that seemed to go on in every direction without obstruction. The sky above it was enormous. That specific Montana enormousness that Evelyn, who had grown up in Denver, had never quite gotten used to. It pressed down and opened up at the same time, and if you weren't careful, it made you feel very small. And if you were careful, it made you feel like size didn't matter much one way or the other. She was watching the horizon when Hector spoke. "You looking for work at the Whitmore place?" "No," she said. A pause. "Whitmore's not much for visitors." "I know." Another pause. "He's a fair man, just don't get me wrong, but he keeps his circle tight since—" He stopped himself. "Since what?" she asked. Hector kept his eyes on the horses. Since his wife left him, or whatever it was that happened. A beat. 4 years back. The word wife hit her like a physical thing. She wasn't his wife. They'd never married, had planned to, had been 3 weeks from it when her father stepped in. But apparently the story the town had been given was something more formal than the truth. She didn't correct him. "He raised the boy alone?" she asked. "Him and whatever help he can keep. Hard life out here for a child. But the boy's all right. Strange little thing, but all right." Strange. She turned that word over. Her father had been strange, still, watchful, too smart for his age, terrifyingly perceptive. Her mother had called it a gift. Her father had called it a liability. She wondered which one Noah had gotten. She heard the ranch before she saw it. The sound of something being hammered, rhythmic and deliberate, cutting through the cold air. Then the fence line appeared, and past it a low barn and a house that was larger than she'd expected, built with some care, the logs chinked properly, the roof solid. A man was at the fence. He had his back to the road, working on a post that had heaved in the frost, and he had his coat off despite the cold, his breath making clouds in the air with each swing of the maul. He was broader than she remembered, his hair longer, the set of his shoulders different. The difference between a young man's body and a man who had spent 4 years doing heavy work. But she would have known him at 1,000 yards. Her throat closed. Hector pulled the wagon to a stop at the gate and called out, "Whitmore, got your order." Caleb turned. He looked at the wagon. He looked at Hector. His expression was neutral, already moving toward transaction, already in the mode of getting the work done. And then he saw her. His face went absolutely still. Not the stillness of surprise. Something deeper. Something that looked like a man watching the world reorganize itself into a shape he had convinced himself it would never take again. Evelyn climbed down from the wagon before she'd decided to. Her feet found the frozen ground, and she stood at the gate with her bag in her hand. And she looked at him, and she didn't say anything because she had forgotten every word she'd ever planned to say. "Evelyn," he said. His voice was flat. Not cold. Flat. The way a voice gets when someone is controlling it very carefully because the alternative is unacceptable. "Caleb." He looked at her for a long time, at her face, at the dress, at the bag. His expression did not open up, did not move toward her. It closed, the way a door closes, and when he spoke again his voice was the same flat, controlled thing. "You need to go back wherever you came from." "I can't," she said. "You managed it once without any trouble." That landed where it was meant to. She kept her feet. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Just talk. If you still want me to leave after that, I will. I'll walk back to town myself, I don't care. But I need you to hear me." He looked at Hector, who had developed a sudden intense interest in the horse's ears. "Fine," Caleb said. His jaw was tight. "Hector, you can leave the order at the barn. I'll settle up next week." He turned and walked toward the house without looking back at her. She followed him. The inside of the house was spare but not cold. A wood stove in the main room, a table with 2 chairs, a shelf with a handful of books, and a tin cup, and a small carved horse that looked like someone had made it by hand and not quite finished it. There was a child's boot by the door. One boot. She looked at it. Just one, sitting there on its side the way a child leaves things, with no thought for tidiness or logic, the lace undone and the toe scuffed to nothing. And something happened behind her eyes that she had to work very hard to keep from happening on her face. Caleb stood by the stove with his arms crossed. He didn't offer her a seat, didn't offer anything. "Talk," he said. She set down her bag. She had not rehearsed this, had given up rehearsing it somewhere around the 100th mile of frozen track this morning, and what came out was not the careful, structured account she'd intended. "My father took him from me," she said, "the day after he was born. I was in the bed still. I couldn't. He came and he took him, and he said that if I said a word, if I tried to fight it, he would ruin you. He knew about the land you'd borrowed money on. He had people who would call it in. You'd lose everything." Her voice was shaking, which she hated. "He said he'd already arranged for Noah to go to you, that you'd be the one raising him, and that if I cooperated, he wouldn't make things worse. That I'd signed papers. I hadn't signed anything. He forged them, or had someone. But I didn't know how to prove it. I didn't have—" She stopped, started again. "I tried to write to you. I tried so many times. He had the mail watched. I tried to get word to "Stop," Caleb said. She stopped. He was looking at the stove. The muscle in his jaw was working. His arms were still crossed, but his hands had found his elbows, gripping them. "You had years," he said finally. "You had 4 years. And you're showing up now in a torn dress in January with one bag, and you want me to believe that the only thing that kept you away was your father?" "Yes," she said. "He's not here, Evelyn. Wherever you've been, Denver, wherever, he's not standing behind you right now." "He is, though," she said, "in every way that matters. He has lawyers, he has influence, he has people in every county between here and then why come back? If he's so powerful, why now?" She looked at him. "Because I climbed out a window," she said, "in the middle of the night, 6 days ago, with one bag and $7 and no plan except to get here before I lost my nerve." He looked at her then, really looked at her, at the dress, at the worn bag handles, at whatever was showing on her face that she no longer had the energy to hide. "Papa?" The voice came from the hallway. Small, tentative. Evelyn's heart stopped beating. She was almost certain of it. Just stopped, for one full second, suspended in her chest like something waiting to be told what to do next. A boy appeared in the doorway. He was small for his age, or she thought he might be. She didn't actually know what 4-year-olds were supposed to look like. With dark hair that needed cutting and Caleb's eyes, deep brown, serious. He was in his stocking feet, his shirt untucked, and he was holding the missing boot. He saw Evelyn. He stopped. She had expected him not to know her. Of course, he didn't know her. He'd been 11 days old. He had no memory of her. He had no frame of reference for what she was or why she was standing in his father's house looking at him like she was afraid he might disappear. But Noah Whitmore stood in that doorway and stared at her, and something moved across his face that she couldn't name. Not recognition, exactly. Something older than recognition. Something more like the sensation of hearing a sound you didn't know you'd been listening for. "Who are you?" he asked. She couldn't speak. She tried and couldn't. He took a step into the room. His eyes didn't leave her face. "You're the lady," he said slowly, "from my dreams." The silence that followed, that was the loudest thing Evelyn had ever heard. And then he said quieter, like he was telling her something he'd never told anyone. "You're my mama." Caleb made a sound. Not a word. A sound low and involuntary, like something had hit him somewhere unprotected. Evelyn went down on one knee on the wooden floor, and she didn't plan to, and she didn't care. She was at eye level with him now, this boy who was somehow both a stranger and the most familiar thing she had ever seen. And she looked at him and she said, "Yes." Just that. Just yes. Noah looked at her for a long moment with his serious dark eyes. Then he took 3 steps across the floor and put his arms around her neck. Not gently, but the way children do things. Fully, completely, without reservation. And she held him, and she felt his heart beating against her collarbone, fast and warm and entirely real, and she did not cry. She had promised herself she would not cry in front of him. She broke that promise almost immediately. Caleb turned away from both of them, walked to the window, stood there with his back to the room, his hands at his sides, looking at something outside that probably wasn't anything in particular. After a while, without turning around, he said, "You can have the spare room, tonight. Just tonight." She heard the condition in it clearly. Just tonight meant nothing is decided. Just tonight meant I don't know what to do with you, and I don't trust you, and that boy still needs to have breakfast tomorrow, and I cannot afford to fall apart over this. "Thank you," she said. Noah pulled back to look at her face. He touched her cheek with one small, serious hand, inspecting the tear tracks there with the same expression he'd probably used to inspect a piece of equipment he'd never seen before and was trying to understand. "Why are you crying?" he asked. "Because I'm happy," she said. He considered this. "Papa cries sometimes," he said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't think I see, but I do." From the window, Caleb said nothing. Outside, the January sky was doing the thing it did sometimes in Montana, going suddenly, furiously bright, clouds parting for no reason, light falling on everything at once like the weather was trying to make a point. Evelyn held her son and watched the light change on the floor and understood that the hardest part was still ahead. That tonight was not a resolution, that Caleb's anger was a real thing, and her father was a real thing, and the years between her and this boy were a real thing, and none of that was going to unhappen just because a 4-year-old had looked at her with recognition she didn't deserve and called her a name she hadn't earned yet. But she was here. She was in the room. Her feet were on the floor. After 4 years of being trapped and controlled and silenced, she was finally, terrifyingly, standing in the place she had crawled across 3 states to reach. And the boy in her arms was warm, and he was real. And for the first time in 4 years, she let herself think the things she had not allowed herself to think. Maybe. Maybe this. Caleb turned from the window then. He looked at his son in the arms of the woman he had spent 4 years hating with a precision and dedication that had kept him functional when nothing else could. And his face was doing something complicated and private that he was clearly trying very hard to keep that way. "Noah," he said, "go get your other boot." Noah considered arguing. She could see it in his face, that brief flash of protest. And then, with the particular practicality of a child who has learned to read a room, decided against it. He patted Evelyn's cheek once, deliberately, like he was making a decision, and then turned and went back down the hall. The room without him was very quiet. Caleb looked at her. "He does that," he said finally. "Dreams things, says things he couldn't know." His voice was careful, controlled, working to stay matter-of-fact. "I don't know what I thought it was." "He's perceptive," she said. "He gets it from—" She stopped herself. Not the moment for that. "He seems like a remarkable child." "He is," Caleb said, and the pride in those 2 words was the first uncalculated thing she'd heard from him since she arrived. It was there, and then it was gone, and his face was closed again. "Tonight," he said again. "One night. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." She nodded. He picked up his coat from the chair where he'd thrown it coming in. "There's food on the stove," he said. "Help yourself." He was already at the door. "I've got work to finish." He went out. She stood in the middle of his house and listened to his boots cross the porch, and then crunch away through the frozen ground. And she looked at the carved horse on the shelf, and the child's boot that Noah had apparently carried in and left on the floor near the door, and the 2 chairs at the table that had probably never had a third one pulled up to them. She was here. He hadn't thrown her out. It was not enough. It was a long, terrible distance from enough. But she had spent 4 years in a house where every door was locked, and she knew the difference between a door that was locked and a door that was just closed. She crossed to the stove, found a bowl, found the pot with whatever Caleb had left simmering, and she started, slowly, carefully, from the beginning. The spare room was a former storage space that Caleb had never quite finished converting. There was a cot against one wall with a blanket folded at the foot of it, a small window that let in a thin stripe of gray morning light, and a hook on the back of the door where someone had hung a man's old work jacket that no longer fit anyone in this house. That was it. No dresser, no mirror, no second blanket. Evelyn sat on the edge of the cot that first night and listened to the ranch settle around her. The creak of the roof in the wind, the distant sound of an animal shifting in the barn, and from somewhere down the hall, the small, unmistakable sounds of a child sleeping. Breath, movement, the occasional murmur of whatever children murmur when they're deep enough in sleep that the waking world stops filtering what comes out. She didn't sleep for a long time. When she did, it was shallow and broken, and she woke before dawn to the sound of Caleb already moving in the kitchen, already starting the day with the efficiency of a man who had trained himself to need nothing from the night hours except a few hours of unconsciousness, and then back at it. She got up, folded the blanket, put on her dress, the same dress, still, and went to the kitchen doorway. Caleb was at the stove. He had coffee on and was cutting salt pork with the focused disinterest of a man who has done a task so many thousands of times that his hands do it independently of his mind. He heard her and didn't turn around. "Coffee's ready," he said. She poured herself a cup and stood by the table, not sitting because he hadn't offered the chair, and she was not going to assume. The silence between them was not comfortable. It was the specific silence of two people who have things to say to each other and have not yet established the terms under which saying them is possible. Noah appeared at 6:15, hair in every direction, one sock on and one in his hand, looking at the world with the mild displeasure of a person who has been dragged from a perfectly good dream. He stopped when he saw Evelyn, looked at her. Something in his face decided something. "You're still here," he said. "I'm still here," she said. He seemed satisfied by this in a way that she couldn't fully account for. He climbed into his chair at the table and put his sock on with great concentration while Caleb set a plate in front of him without being asked. The routine of it worn so smooth it happened like a reflex. "Can she eat with us?" Noah asked, not looking at his father. A pause, short but real. "Get yourself a plate," Caleb said to Evelyn. Not warmly, but not the alternative either. She got herself a plate. The first week was not a negotiation. It was more like two people walking the same stretch of ground very carefully and pretending they weren't aware of each other's footsteps. Caleb had not told her to leave again after that first night. He had also not told her to stay. What he had done was go back to work with the single-minded intensity of a man who solves problems by outworking them, and left Evelyn to figure out her own geometry in a space that had not been designed with her in mind. She started by being useful because it was the only currency she had. The first morning she found the water bucket empty and filled it from the pump without being asked. The second morning she had the coffee on before Caleb came down. By the third morning she had found the mending pile behind the door. 3 of Noah's shirts, a pair of Caleb's work pants with a blown seam, 2 socks with holes in the heels, and sat by the window in the thin winter light and worked through it with the needle and thread she found in a tin on the shelf. She was not a gifted seamstress. The stitches were functional and nothing more. But the shirts were wearable when she was done, and when Noah put one on the next morning and ran his hand down the repaired seam with an expression of mild scientific curiosity, she felt something in her chest that wasn't quite pride but was in the neighborhood. Caleb noticed the mending. He didn't say anything about it, but that evening he left a pair of his gloves on the table, work gloves, the leather at the thumb starting to separate. And when she came down in the morning, they were still there, positioned in a way that was not exactly a request, but was not nothing either. She repaired the gloves. He picked them up the next day and put them on and went out to work and still didn't say anything. This was, she understood, the closest thing to acknowledgement she was going to get right now, and she took it. Noah was a different situation entirely. He had decided, with the categorical efficiency of a young child who has assessed a situation and reached a conclusion, that Evelyn was his mother, and that this was settled, and that the interesting question now was everything else. He wanted to know where she had come from. He wanted to know what Denver looked like. He wanted to know if she could whistle, and when she demonstrated that she could, he spent the better part of an afternoon attempting to learn it himself, lips pursed in intense concentration, producing nothing but breath for an hour, until he finally managed a thin, wobbly sound that made him go still with amazement at himself. "Did you hear that?" he demanded. "I heard it," she said. He did it again, louder. Then he ran to find his father. She heard him in the barn, heard the thin whistle cut through the cold air, heard Caleb's voice, something low she couldn't make out. And then Noah's laugh, quick and bright, the laugh of a child who has achieved something and knows it. She stood at the kitchen window and listened to that laugh and held very still. But Noah's ease with her was its own complication. She could see it creating problems she hadn't anticipated. The way he would reach for her hand sometimes when they were walking, automatically, without thought, as if the gesture were already a habit. The way he had started saying she and her around the house in a way that had a particular weight to it, a particular meaning. The way Caleb watched this happen with an expression that gave nothing away and everything away at the same time. One evening, about 10 days in, Caleb came in from the barn later than usual and found Noah at the table with Evelyn, the two of them deep in something. She was showing him how to make a paper bird, folding and creasing with the deliberate slowness of someone who learned it as a child and is reconstructing it from muscle memory. And Noah was watching her hands with the absolute focus he gave to things that interested him. Caleb stopped in the doorway. He watched for a moment, just a moment. Then he came in and hung up his coat and washed his hands at the basin. And when he sat down at the table, his face was the controlled, careful thing it always was. But his eyes were doing something different, something that looked almost like pain. "It's a crane," Noah told him without looking up. "Watch." Evelyn finished the last fold and set the paper bird on the table. It wasn't perfect. One wing was slightly higher than the other, but it was recognizably a crane. Noah picked it up and held it out to his father. Caleb took it, looked at it for a second, set it carefully on the shelf next to the carved wooden horse. "Bedtime," he said. 12 days after Evelyn arrived, Caleb came in from working in the far pasture in the late afternoon and found her in the barn. She had not been asked to go there. She had gone because the third of Caleb's remaining cattle, a bony red cow he called nothing in particular, which suggested she was recent, had been standing oddly in the corner of her stall since morning, and Evelyn, who had learned more about livestock in 12 days of watching than she'd known in her entire life, had recognized the list of the animal's posture as something worth checking on. She was crouched beside the cow when Caleb came in, her skirt in the straw, her fingers pressed along the cow's side, feeling for something she wasn't sure she'd recognize when she found it. He stopped. "What are you doing?" "She's been standing wrong all day," Evelyn said. "Off her water since yesterday. I think she might be—" She felt it then, a hard, tight section just behind the ribs, and the cow shifted uneasily. "I think she might have a gut problem. Impaction, maybe. My neighbor in Denver kept cattle for a while. He used to—" "Get up," Caleb said. Not harshly. He was already moving past her, already crouching in the same position she'd been in, his hands going to the same spot with the certainty of someone who has done this before. He pressed. The cow moved again, stomped once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Yeah, that's an impaction." He looked up at her, just for a second. "How'd you know?" he asked. "I watched her all day," she said. "I kept thinking I was imagining it." He turned back to the cow. "You weren't." He was quiet for a moment. "Rope's on the wall, the long one. I need you to hold her head." She got the rope. She held the cow's head while Caleb worked, his hands moving with the knowledge of this animal and this problem that came from years of doing exactly this. And it was hard work, the cow unhappy and resistant. And it took the better part of an hour before the animal passed the blockage and stood easier, finally dropping her head to the water bucket. They both stood there in the straw, breathing. Caleb looked at his hands, looked at the cow, looked, briefly, reluctantly, at Evelyn. "You held her steady," he said. "I've been told I'm stronger than I look," she said. It wasn't quite a smile that crossed his face. It was the ghost of one. There for half a second and then gone, buried back under everything else. He picked up his gloves from the stall post, the repaired ones. He held them for a second. "Thank you," he said, "for the gloves." "They were just pulling apart at the thumb," she said. "Took 5 minutes." "Still," he said. He was looking at the gloves and not at her. "Still." He went out. She stood in the straw with the cow's warm breath in the cold air and thought that still was possibly the most significant thing he'd said to her since she arrived. The trouble came from town. She'd known it would. She just hadn't anticipated the specific form it would take. It was May Sutton who warned her, arriving at the ranch one morning in a borrowed buggy with a look on her face that said she had made the 9-mile trip because the alternative was not acceptable. People are talking, she said over coffee at Caleb's table. Caleb was out, Noah in the barn. And it's not the kind of talking that stays quiet. Harriet Marsh at the dry goods store has a mouth like a telegraph wire and twice the traffic, and word is going around that Caleb Whitmore's runaway wife has turned back up and installed herself, and nobody knows why or what she wants. "I'm not installed," Evelyn said. "Honey, you've been here 2 weeks and you're mending his clothes. In this town, that's a ceremony." May wrapped both hands around her cup. "The issue is that your story, whatever version people are telling, doesn't have any documentation to it. As far as the town records go, you're nobody. Caleb he told people you'd gone. He didn't file anything legal, but what your father filed in Denver, do you know what's on paper there?" Evelyn felt the cold in the kitchen increase, though the stove was burning fine. "He filed papers saying she stopped, that I had abandoned the child voluntarily, that I was unfit, that I had surrendered all claim." May's face was careful. "And is there anything that says otherwise?" "There are letters I wrote that were never sent. I kept copies. He didn't know I kept copies. I have them in my bag. I've had them for 4 years, but they're just letters. They're just words on paper. Anyone could say—" "Letters are a start," May said, "but you need more than a start. Because there are people in this town who are already deciding your trouble, and trouble in a small place gets to a man's business fast." Evelyn looked at the paper crane on the shelf. "What kind of business?" she asked. "Caleb's been trying to get a bank loan for the spring. He needs it to rebuild the herd after the last hard winter took 3 head. The man he needs it from, Gerald Ashby at First Territorial, is a careful man, very sensitive to reputation and association." "My father knows Gerald Ashby," Evelyn said. May went very still. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because my father knows every banker between Denver and the Canadian border," Evelyn said. "It's how he operates. He doesn't need to come here himself. He never comes himself. He just makes a call, writes a letter, says the right things to the right people." She looked at her hands on the table. "He's probably already done it. The only question is whether it's already affected the loan or whether it's still working its way through." May looked at her for a long moment. "You need to tell Caleb," she said. "All of it. Not the version you're comfortable with. All of it." "I know," Evelyn said. "Tonight," May said. "Not tomorrow." She told him that night. Noah was in bed, and the kitchen was quiet, and Caleb was going through a ledger at the table with the expression of a man doing arithmetic that isn't adding up. And she sat down across from him and said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you say anything." He looked up. He had learned, she thought, that when she prefaced something like that, it was worth paying attention. He closed the ledger. She told him about Gerald Ashby, about her father's method, the network of contacts, the letters and phone calls, the way he operated at a distance so nothing could be traced back to him directly. She told him that she believed the loan application might already be compromised, and she told him why. Caleb's face went through several things while she talked. The controlled blankness, something underneath it that looked like anger. Underneath that, something that looked more like exhaustion. The particular exhaustion of a man who has been working very hard to build something and can feel the ground shifting under it. When she finished, he said, "How long have you known this?" "About Ashby specifically, since this morning," May told me. "About your father's reach, about the way he operates." "My whole life," she said. "But I didn't know about the loan until today. I swear to you, Caleb, if I'd known—" "What would you have done differently?" he asked. Not hostile, genuinely asking. She opened her mouth and closed it again. "I don't know," she said finally. "Come earlier, or later, or from a different direction. I don't know." She pressed her palms flat on the table. "I'm sorry. I don't know how to fix this." Caleb was quiet for a moment. He turned his coffee cup in a slow circle. "The loan application is in," he said. "I can't pull it without raising more questions than leaving it does." His jaw worked. "I'll go talk to Ashby myself, directly. If your father's already been in contact, I'd rather know that from Ashby's face than wait for a letter." "He won't show it on his face," Evelyn said. "That's not how men like Ashby work. He'll be polite, and he'll say he's reviewing things, and he'll deny the application 6 weeks from now for reasons that sound procedural." Caleb looked at her. "You sound like you know how to fight them." "I know how they work," she said. "I've watched my father do it my whole life. Knowing how it works and having the means to stop it are different things. What do you have? He asked. Those letters you mentioned. What else? She had not told him about the letters before this. The fact that he'd registered it, filed it, and was reaching for it now told her something about the quality of attention he'd been paying. She went to her room. She came back with the packet. Not the official-looking thing she'd once imagined presenting, but what it actually was. A bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth and tied with kitchen twine, worn at the edges from being moved and moved and moved again over 4 years. She set it on the table. He looked at it, didn't touch it. 22 letters, she said, written over 4 years. The ones I kept copies of before my father's people could intercept the originals. They explain what he did, what he made me sign, the threats he used. She paused. There's also a copy of the papers he filed in Denver, the ones claiming I'd abandoned Noah voluntarily. I got it from a clerk's office in Billings. I stopped there on the way here. I told the clerk I needed a copy for legal purposes. He didn't ask more than that. Caleb looked at the packet for a long moment. Then he reached out and touched the edge of the oilcloth, just briefly. You've been carrying this for 4 years, he said. Yes. He pulled his hand back. I'll go to town tomorrow. Talk to Asa Holt. He's the closest thing Coldwater Creek has to a lawyer. I want his eyes on the papers your father filed before I do anything else. All right, she said. He picked up the ledger again. You should sleep, he said. She started to get up, stopped. Caleb, she said. He didn't look up. I know you're not. I know this isn't. She stopped because none of the sentences she'd started were the one she wanted, and then she found the one she meant. I'm not expecting anything from you, except to be believed. That's the only thing I'm asking for right now. He was quiet for a moment. I'm working on it, he said. It was the most honest thing he'd said to her. She recognized it as that. That's enough, she said. For now. Asa Holt was a small, dry man with wire spectacles and the deliberate speech of someone who had learned to be careful with words because the wrong ones in the wrong order could cost someone their farm. He read the documents Caleb brought him, the filed abandonment papers, 3 of Evelyn's copied letters, and he read them slowly, twice, without expression. Then he set them on his desk and looked at Caleb over his spectacles. These papers out of Denver, he said. The filing date is wrong. Caleb went still. What do you mean? The date on here is March 12th, 1888, but according to the county notation at the bottom, it was received in Billings on March 8th. Holt took off his spectacles and polished them. A document can't be received before it was filed. Either the filing date is falsified or the receipt stamp is. Either way, there's an irregularity. Caleb looked at the papers. That's enough to challenge them? It's enough to ask questions that are difficult to answer without revealing how the document was produced. Holt replaced his spectacles. Whether that gets you anywhere depends on who's asked and who's answering. He looked at Caleb. You understand I'm not a judge. I'm a man with a law degree who draws up deeds and wills and occasionally helps someone argue about a fence line. A case like this, if it becomes a case, goes somewhere with a real court. Is there a judge we can get to without going through Denver channels? Caleb asked. Holt was quiet for a moment. There's a circuit judge, Harlan Cole, who comes through Billings 3 times a year. He's due in February. He's a fair man, known him 20 years. He paused. But getting a matter before him means you've got something to put before him. You'd need more than these letters. You'd need a witness who can testify to the circumstances. Someone who knew what Hartley did, knew it directly. Caleb rode home thinking about that. He didn't tell Evelyn the detail about the filing date. Not yet. He wasn't sure why. Some combination of needing to think it through himself first and not being ready yet to hand her something that might turn out to be smaller than it looked. But that evening, when she was washing up the dinner dishes and Noah had been put to bed, he stood in the kitchen doorway and said, Holt thinks there might be something in the papers your father filed, something irregular. She turned from the basin, water dripping from her hands, her face careful. What kind of irregular? She asked. Dates that don't line up. It might mean nothing. It might mean something. He watched her face. Holt's going to look more closely. She turned back to the basin. Her shoulders did something complicated in private. My father is not a careless man, she said after a moment. If there's an error in those papers, it's not because he made a mistake. What do you mean? She was quiet for a second, turning that over. I mean that maybe someone helped make that error. On purpose. She dried her hands. He had people who worked for him who didn't always agree with what he did, who went along because they had no choice. If someone made the dates wrong intentionally, to leave a thread to pull. She stopped. You're thinking of someone specific, Caleb said. His clerk, she said. A man named Arthur Briggs. He'd been with my father since before I was born. He was kind to me when he could be. He used to leave the window in the second-floor hallway unlocked. The window I climbed out of. She paused. He knew everything my father did. Everything. Caleb looked at her. Where's this man now? He asked. Denver, she said. Or he was. He's old. He might, if he's alive and he's willing to talk, Caleb said. That changes things. The silence in the kitchen was different from the silences they'd been living in. It had direction to it. I'd have to contact him carefully, she said. If my father knew I was trying to reach Arthur, not you, Caleb said. Holt has a contact in Denver, a solicitor. He could make the inquiry in a way that doesn't come back to you. He looked at her steadily. If you're willing. She held his gaze. I've been waiting 4 years to be willing, she said. He nodded once, turned for the door. Caleb, she said. He stopped. Why are you helping me? She asked. After everything, why? He had his hand on the doorframe. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Because Noah asked me this morning if you were going to stay, he said, and I didn't know what to tell him. A pause. This isn't... He stopped, started over. I want the truth. Whatever it is. I need to know what actually happened, not because of you. He looked back at her then, just briefly, and his face was everything he was trying not to let it be. Because I've been raising a boy on a story that might not be true, and he deserves better than that. He went out. Evelyn stood in the kitchen, and the fire in the stove settled and popped, and the cold outside pressed against the walls, and she thought about a boy who dreamed of a woman he'd never met and called her by her name without knowing how he knew it. She thought about Arthur Briggs and his unlocked window and the filing date on a document that didn't line up. She thought about her father, in Denver, in his house, at his long oak table, probably unaware yet that the thing he'd built so carefully over 4 years had developed a crack. Just a small one. Just a date that didn't match. Just a window left unlocked by an old man with a conscience. Small things. Small, precise things. She dried her hands completely and folded the cloth and set it on the edge of the basin, and she thought, small things are how it starts. 2 days later, the trouble from town arrived with a face on it. 3 men came to the ranch in the late morning, not threatening in any obvious way, not armed visibly, just 3 men in good coats who pulled up in a carriage that was too clean for the road they'd taken to get here. And the man who stepped down first was one Evelyn recognized, though she'd only seen him once, briefly, in a photograph her father had shown her years ago, with some remark about useful connections in the Northwest Territories. He was tall, 50-ish. He had the face of a man who was accustomed to being the most important person in whatever room he entered. Gerald Ashby. He hadn't come about the loan. She knew that before he opened his mouth. The loan was a procedural matter. You didn't drive 9 miles in a good coat for a procedural matter. Caleb had seen them coming from the field. He arrived at the porch just as Ashby reached it, and the 2 men looked at each other with the specific measuring look of men who are sizing up a situation. Mr. Whitmore, Ashby said, I hope I'm not interrupting. You are, Caleb said, but go ahead. Ashby almost smiled. Almost. I've had some correspondence recently from an associate in Denver regarding your current household arrangement. I want to be frank with you. The bank has an interest in the stability of its borrower's circumstances, and my household arrangement, Caleb said, the woman who's staying here, Evelyn Hartley, as she was. Ashby's tone was careful, polished, the tone of a man delivering bad news in a way that keeps his own hands clean. She's a person with a complicated legal history in Colorado, Mr. Whitmore. An abandoned minor child, certain financial irregularities with her family. She didn't abandon anyone, Caleb said, and the financial irregularities you're referring to belong to her father. A pause. Ashby recalibrated slightly. Be that as it may, my concern is that the association, given the current pending application. Are you telling me the loan is at risk? Caleb asked. I'm saying there are questions that would be easier to address if the situation were simplified. Simplified. Evelyn, standing in the doorway behind Caleb, heard the word land. She watched Caleb's back, watched his shoulders, and did not move. I'll give you an answer on simplification, Caleb said. The answer is no. The woman staying in my house is the mother of my son. She is here with my knowledge and my consent. Any questions about that can go to Asa Holt. He held Ashby's gaze. Now, about the loan. You make your decision on the merits of my application. If you can't do that, I'll find another bank, and I'll do it without any hard feelings, but I'll do it. Ashby looked at him for a moment, looked past him, very briefly, at Evelyn in the doorway. I see, he said. I think you do, Caleb said. Ashby nodded slowly, the nod of a man adjusting to terrain he hadn't expected. He turned back to his carriage. When they were gone, the dust settling on the track, Caleb stood on the porch and didn't move for a moment. Evelyn came to stand beside him. That cost you something, she said quietly. Saying that. Probably, he said. I can leave, she said. If it would protect the... No, he said. It came out faster than she expected. Faster than he seemed to expect too, judging by the brief set of his jaw after. No, he said again, quieter. We started something with Holt. We finish it. He looked at the empty road. And Noah would... He stopped. I know, she said. He didn't look at her, but he didn't move away either. They stood on the porch in the cold January air, not quite together and not quite apart, while the wind came off the open ground and the carriage track slowly filled with drifting snow. And somewhere in the barn, Noah was probably talking to the horses the way he did when he thought no one was listening, seriously, thoroughly, as if they understood every word. Maybe they did. Evelyn had stopped assuming she knew which things were impossible. Asa Holt's contact in Denver sent word back in 11 days, which was faster than anyone had expected and slower than Evelyn could stand. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, addressed to Holt, and Holt sent his boy out to the Broken Bow with a note asking Caleb to come in when he had a chance. Caleb read the note at breakfast, looked at Evelyn across the table and said, I'll go this morning. I'm coming with you, she said. He looked at her for a second. Noah was eating his porridge with the focused efficiency of a child who has learned that the faster breakfast disappears, the faster the interesting part of the day begins. All right, Caleb said. Noah looked up. Can I come? No, they said at the same time. Noah looked at his porridge, accepted this with the particular resignation of a child who has learned that some decisions are not subject to appeal, and went back to eating. May Sutton agreed to sit with him for the morning without being asked twice. She arrived at the ranch with a tin of something that smelled like molasses cookies and the brisk efficiency of a woman who considers child-minding a logistical problem to be solved rather than a burden to be endured. And Noah, who had developed a complex and apparently satisfying relationship with May over the past weeks, greeted her with the information that he had found a mouse nest in the barn wall and wanted to show her. After breakfast, May said, and sat down at the table. Caleb and Evelyn rode into Coldwater Creek in the buckboard, 9 miles of frozen track with the January wind cutting across the open ground, and they didn't talk much. What conversation there was stayed practical. The condition of the road, a section of fence Caleb had noticed heaving in the frost. But the silence between the practical words was different from the silences of the early days. It had less weight to it, or different weight. She wasn't sure which. Holt's office was above the dry goods store, up a narrow stair that creaked on every step. He was waiting for them, the letter already open on his desk, his spectacles on. He read it to them straight through without preamble. Arthur Briggs was alive. He was 71 years old and living in a boarding house on the south side of Denver, and he had been living there for 14 months. Since, the letter noted carefully, he had separated from the employment of a man named Clarence Hartley, under circumstances that the contact described as abrupt and not entirely voluntary. Briggs was in reasonable health. He was, according to Holt's contact, a man who had things on his conscience and had been waiting for a reason to put them down. He was willing to talk. I was specifically willing to provide a written statement regarding the preparation and filing of certain documents in the spring of 1888, if approached through proper legal channels. Holt set the letter down and looked at them both over his spectacles. That's your thread, he said to Evelyn. That's the man who can pull it. She looked at the letter, the paper it was written on. The careful handwriting of someone else's contact passing along word of an old man in a boarding house with things on his conscience. He could change his mind, she said, between now and whenever we could get a statement from him. He could, Holt agreed, which is why I'd like to get a solicitor to him within the week, if you're agreeable. He looked at Caleb. There's a cost to that. How much? Caleb said. Holt named a number. Caleb's face did not change, but something in the set of his jaw did. I have some money, Evelyn said. Not much. I came here with $7.40. I've spent about $3 of it. But I had a small account, separate from my father's accounts. A savings account my mother set up for me before she died, in her name, that my father didn't know about. I contacted the bank before I left Denver. They can wire money to Billings. She looked at Holt. It's not a large amount, but it might cover the solicitor and some of the filing costs. Holt looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating his assessment of a situation. How much are we talking? She told him. He was quiet for a moment. That covers the solicitor and the filing, he said. It doesn't cover travel to Billings for the circuit court hearing, if it comes to that, or any of the other associated costs. One thing at a time, Caleb said. Holt nodded. One thing at a time, he agreed, and reached for his pen. Autumn. The storm came in the last week of January without much warning, the way bad weather moved in this part of Montana. Not building gradually, but arriving all at once, as if it had been waiting just over the horizon for a moment of inattention. By the time the sky went the particular flat white that preceded serious snow, Caleb had the cattle moved to the near pasture and the extra wood stacked on the porch and the water barrels filled, working with the quick, economical urgency of a man who has done storm preparation enough times to have it down to a sequence. Evelyn worked beside him. She did not ask what to do. She watched what he did and did the part she could do. And when there was something she didn't know how to do, she asked once, clearly, and did it. She was not fast. She made mistakes, stacked the wood wrong the first time, had to restack it, miscounted the feed sacks and had to recount. But she didn't apologize for the mistakes or slow down to discuss them. She just corrected and continued. Caleb noticed this. He said nothing about it. But she caught him watching her once, briefly, with an expression that was less guarded than his usual ones. Something that looked almost like assessment, the way you'd look at a tool you'd underestimated. They got inside ahead of the worst of it, and then the storm closed around the house, and everything contracted to the small warm space of the kitchen and the range and the lamplight, and Noah sat at the table with a piece of charcoal and paper that May had left him and drew things with absolute concentration while the wind made its sounds outside. Caleb sat across from Noah with the account book. Evelyn mended. She had worked through the original pile and now Caleb had started leaving new things, still without asking directly, things simply appearing on the chair by the window. She had stopped remarking on it. At some point, Noah looked up from his drawing and said, without introduction, "At my old school in Billings, before we moved here, there was a boy named Thomas who didn't have a mother either." The room was quiet for a second. "What happened to Thomas's mother?" Evelyn asked, keeping her voice even. "She died," Noah said matter-of-factly. Thomas cried about it a lot. "I didn't cry because I didn't know where mine was." He looked at his drawing. "But I thought about it." Caleb's pen had stopped moving. "You don't have to have gone to school in Billings to have thoughts like that," Evelyn said after a moment. "I know," Noah said. He held up his drawing. It was a house, a simple one, square, with a triangle roof and smoke coming from the chimney, the kind of house every child draws. But he'd put 3 figures in front of it, 3 stick figures of unequal height. "I drew our house," he said. Caleb looked at the drawing for a long moment. "That's a good house," he said. His voice was even, too even. Noah seemed satisfied. He put the drawing down and picked up the charcoal again and started on something new. Evelyn did not look at Caleb. She looked at her mending, at the needle going through the fabric, and she made her hand stay steady. Later, after Noah was in bed and the storm was still doing its work against the walls, Caleb poured himself a cup of coffee and stood by the stove and said, without looking at her, "He's never drawn that before." She didn't ask what he meant. She knew what he meant. "He's happy," she said carefully. "That doesn't mean—" She stopped. "I'm not trying to make a claim on that, on what it means." "I know you're not," he said. And then, after a long pause, That might be the problem. She looked up at him then. He was still looking at the stove, at the fire through the grate. What do you mean? She asked. He was quiet for a moment, working it out or deciding whether to say it. You're careful, he said. You're careful about what you ask for, what you take up. You've been here almost 3 weeks and you haven't once asked me. He stopped, started again. You haven't asked me anything for yourself. Everything is for the legal case, for Noah, for the ranch. He turned his cup in his hands. I don't know what to do with that. She set down the mending. I spent 4 years being told I wanted too much, she said, that I was asking for things I had no right to ask for. I learned to be careful about it. She looked at him. If the carefulness is making things harder, I can try to... I didn't say it was making things harder, he said. The fire popped. The wind hit the east wall and moved on. I don't know what we are, he said finally. I don't know what this is. I'm working on what I said I was working on. Believing you. And I think I do. I think I believe you. He set the cup down. But I don't know what comes after that. She looked at him across the kitchen, this man who was broader and harder and more guarded than the one she remembered, and she thought about what she actually wanted, separate from strategy and caution and the long habit of not reaching for things. I want my son, she said, legally, safely, permanently. I want to not be afraid of my father anymore. I want to be useful here, to actually contribute to something, not just take up space while I figure out my legal situation. She paused, and I think I want to know if there's anything left between us that could be worth something. She said it flatly, not as a plea, just as a fact. Not now, not right away, but eventually. I want to know if that's a door that's closed or just closed for now. He looked at her for a long moment. I don't know, he said. That's an honest answer, she said. It's the only kind I have right now, he said. She picked up the mending again. Then that's enough. For now. The storm pressed on through the night, and neither of them said anything else. And it was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest, and honest, she had come to understand, was a thing you had to build from scratch every time, and this was them building it, awkwardly and imperfectly and in the dark. The letter from Holt came 10 days into February, and it was not the one they'd been waiting for. It was from Denver, not from Holt's contact, but addressed directly to Caleb Whitmore at the Broken Bow Spread, Coldwater Creek, Montana, in a hand Evelyn recognized before Caleb had fully unfolded the page. She knew because Caleb's face changed when he read it, just slightly, just enough. What does it say? She asked. He handed it to her without a word. It was from her father's attorney. Not her father himself, of course, never her father himself. And it was written in the careful, bloodless language of legal correspondence, which made it, she had always thought, worse than if it had simply been cruel. It said that Clarence Hartley had become aware that his daughter Evelyn was residing at this address. It said that Mr. Hartley's concern for his daughter's welfare, given her history of instability, prompted him to reach out. It said that should Evelyn Hartley remain at this address and continue to represent herself as having any claim upon the child, Noah Whitmore, Mr. Hartley would have no alternative but to pursue legal remedies available to him as the documented guardian of record in the state of Colorado. Guardian of record. She read that phrase twice. He filed additional papers, she said, after I left. He must have... When he realized I was gone, he filed something, to make the guardianship formal. She lowered the letter. He didn't have that before. He had the abandonment filing, but not an actual guardianship. If he's filed that, can he enforce a Colorado guardianship in Montana? Caleb asked. I don't know, she said. I don't know the answer to that. Holt will, Caleb said, and reached for his coat. Holt looked at the letter and then looked at his bookshelf and pulled down a volume and read for a moment and then looked at them both. Interstate enforcement of guardianship orders is not consistent in 1892, he said. Colorado can claim guardianship. Whether a Montana court recognizes it depends on the judge and the circumstances. He set down the book. However, and this is significant, if Mr. Hartley files in a Colorado court and gets a formal enforcement order, that is a different matter, that has weight that crosses state lines. How long would that take? Evelyn asked. Months if the court is busy, weeks if someone is motivated and has resources. He took off his spectacles. Your father, I assume, has both. Yes, she said. Then we need to move faster than we planned, Holt said. He looked at Caleb. Judge Cole comes through Billings on the 14th of February. That's 11 days from now. I had planned to request a hearing in the March session. But if Hartley is filing in Colorado, we need Cole to see Briggs's statement before any Colorado enforcement order can be issued. Can you get the statement in time, Charles? Caleb asked. My contact telegraphed yesterday. Briggs has already signed a preliminary affidavit. The full written statement is being prepared now. If it's sent by wire transmission in summary and followed by the original document, Holt stopped. It's possible. It's not certain. Then we do what's possible, Evelyn said. Holt looked at her. There's something else, he said. If this goes before Cole in February, you will need to testify, in person, in Billings. She knew what that meant. Billings was where her father's reach was longest in Montana. Billings was where people who owed Clarence Hartley things lived, worked, made decisions. I'll testify, she said. I want to be clear about the risk. I understand the risk, she said. I've understood the risk since I climbed out that window. Tell me what I need to do. There were 9 days between Holt's office and the start of the trip to Billings, and those 9 days had a quality to them that Evelyn would remember for a long time afterward. Not golden, nothing as clean as that, but sharpened. Every ordinary thing was precise. The weight of the water bucket, the sound of Noah's boots on the porch floor, the way the light came through the kitchen window in the morning, thin and white and exact. She and Caleb had begun to work together on the ranch in a way that was less negotiated than it had been. Not because the negotiation was over, but because the terms had become familiar enough that they didn't need to be restated every time. She knew which fence posts were her job to check and which were his. She knew to have coffee ready when he came in from the early morning feeding and not to attempt conversation until the second cup. He knew she was going to do the thing she was going to do and had stopped trying to redirect her toward smaller tasks. On the 7th day, the buckboard's left wheel cracked on a stretch of frozen rut road, and Caleb spent 3 hours on his back in the cold fixing it while Evelyn held the lamp and handed him things, and tried what we're doing in Denver right now. At one point, the wrench slipped and Caleb said something sharp and short under his breath that she pretended not to hear, and then a few minutes later said, I need the smaller one. And she found it and handed it down without comment. When he climbed out from under the wagon, he was cold, and his coat had a new tear in it, and his hands were black with grease, and he looked at the wheel and then at the road ahead and said, That'll hold to Billings. That'll hold further than Billings, she said. He looked at her. You don't know that, he said. No, she said. But it seemed like the thing to say. He looked at her for a second longer, and then he made that sound again, the one that was almost a sound of amusement, the ghost of a thing, there and gone. The second time she'd heard it in 6 weeks. She was counting. Autumn. Noah was not told everything. He was told that they were going to Billings for some important business, that May would stay at the ranch with him, and that they would be back in 3 days. He received this information with the focused seriousness that he applied to most information that directly concerned him. What kind of important business? He asked. Paperwork, Caleb said. Noah considered this. Is it about my mama staying? Evelyn looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Noah. Yes, Caleb said. Okay, Noah said. And then, with complete simplicity, tell them she stays. Caleb put his hand on the top of Noah's head for a moment, just briefly. We're working on it, he said. They left for Billings before dawn on the 13th of February. Caleb and Evelyn and Holt in Holt's buckboard with the repaired wheel, and the road was long and cold and partly iced over in the shaded sections. They talked logistics when they talked at all. The order of the proceeding, what Holt expected Cole to ask, what Briggs's affidavit contained. The affidavit had arrived 2 days before, carried by a courier from Billings who'd received it from Holt's Denver contact. Holt had read it to them both in his office, his voice careful and even, and Evelyn had sat in the chair across from his desk and listened to Arthur Briggs's words. The careful, precise words of a man who had been composing this statement in his head for 4 years and knew exactly what he wanted to say. Briggs stated that in the spring of 1888, under the direction of Clarence Hartley, he had prepared a document falsely representing Evelyn Hartley as having voluntarily abandoned a minor child. He stated that the document had been signed by Evelyn under duress. She had been told by her father that her signature would protect the child's father from financial ruin. He stated that the filing date on the document had been deliberately altered in preparation. He had done this himself, introducing an inconsistency that he hoped might someday serve as evidence of the document's fraudulent nature. He stated that he had remained silent for 4 years out of fear of Clarence Hartley, and had left Hartley's employ 14 months ago when his conscience no longer allowed him to continue. He stated that everything in the affidavit was true to the best of his knowledge and ability to recall. When Holt finished reading, the office was very quiet. He knew, Evelyn said. He knew I'd need something to point to someday. The date error. He put it there on purpose. That's what he says, Holt confirmed. It was Arthur, she said, more to herself than to either of them. He couldn't stop it from happening, but he left me the thread. Caleb had been looking at the window. He looked back at her then. He took a risk doing that, he said. He took every risk he could take without losing his position before he had the chance to do more, she said. She thought of the unlocked window on the second floor, the small, deliberate acts of an old man with limited power doing what limited power allowed him to do. He was always kind to me. I didn't understand for a long time how much it cost him. The courthouse in Billings was a substantial building that took itself seriously, the way institutional buildings of that era did. Stone-faced, high-ceilinged, smelling of paper and cold and the particular mustiness of consequence. Judge Harlan Cole was a heavy-set man of 60 who looked at people the way Evelyn imagined he looked at documents, carefully, without preliminary opinion, seeking the fact of the thing rather than its presentation. They were not the only matter on his docket that morning. They waited in a long bench in the corridor while other business was conducted. A land dispute, something involving an estate, a disagreement about water rights that had clearly been going on for years and wasn't going to resolve today. Holt went over her testimony with her twice more, quietly, sitting beside her on the bench, and Caleb sat on her other side and said nothing but was there, solidly, present in a way that she had not had anyone be present for her in a very long time. At 11:15 they were called in. Cole read Briggs's affidavit without expression. He read the original abandonment filing from Colorado. He looked at the date discrepancy that Holt had flagged and read that section twice. He looked at 3 of Evelyn's copied letters, the ones Holt had selected as most coherent, most specific, most clearly documenting the coercion. Then he looked at Evelyn. "You were present when these letters were written?" he asked. "I wrote them," she said, "in my room at my father's house, on dates that should correspond to the paper," Cole said to Holt. Holt passed him a document, a letter from the paper merchant in Denver, obtained by Holt's contact, showing that the specific paper on which Evelyn's letters were written, a particular weight, a particular mill mark, had been in commercial production beginning in January of 1888 and discontinued in late 1890. The dates on the letters fell within that window. The forgeries would not have had access to that paper. Cole looked at this for a long moment. He looked at Evelyn. "You understand that this proceeding today is preliminary. A formal hearing would require—" "I understand," she said. "I'm asking for a preliminary injunction against enforcement of any Colorado guardianship filing until a full hearing can be conducted. I'm asking for time." Cole looked at Holt. "The Colorado filing, when was it made?" Holt. "Our information suggests within the last 30 days. Cole looked at his desk. He wrote something. He was quiet for a long time that was not actually a long time, but felt like one. "I'll issue a temporary injunction against interstate enforcement pending a formal hearing in the March session," he said. "March 18th. Be here with your witnesses and your documentation." He looked at Evelyn directly. "And get that old man to Billings if you can. A written affidavit is useful. A man in the room is better." "I'll try," she said. "Don't try," Cole said. "Do it." They were back on the road to Coldwater Creek by mid-afternoon, and the light was already thinning toward evening when they passed the halfway point. Evelyn sat on the buckboard bench and felt the cold and thought about March 18th and Arthur Briggs and the long distance between a preliminary injunction and an actual resolution. "You did well in there," Holt said. "I told the truth," she said. "That's all I did." "In front of a judge, that's not nothing," Holt said. Caleb was driving. He'd been quiet since they left Billings. The particular quiet that she'd learned to read as processing rather than withdrawal. He went somewhere internal when he had a lot to work through, and you couldn't rush him there, and you couldn't reach him there, and the thing to do was wait. He waited until they were within 2 miles of Coldwater Creek, until the familiar landmarks of the road were showing up in the last light, until Holt had dozed off in the back of the buckboard with his coat pulled up and his chin on his chest. Then he said quietly, without turning, "My father lost a piece of land once, to a man who knew how to work a legal system. My father didn't know what papers to file, or who to talk to, or what any of it meant, and by the time he understood what was happening, it was done." A pause. "He never recovered from it." "Not really." Evelyn looked at his profile. "You knew what it looked like going in," she said. "When I described what my father does, you already knew it." "I knew what it looks like when it happens to someone who doesn't have the tools to fight it," he said. He was quiet for a moment. "You have the tools, or you know enough to find the people who do." He glanced at her briefly. "That's not nothing either." "I learned it watching him," she said. "Watching my father. Every weapon he used against me. I know how it works because I watched him build it." "Good," Caleb said. "Flat. Certain. Use it." The lights of Coldwater Creek appeared ahead, small and warm in the dark, and the horses knew the road and picked up their pace slightly, the way horses do when the barn is near, and Evelyn looked at those lights and thought about Noah in May's kitchen probably refusing to go to bed, drawing horses with charcoal on paper, thinking about when they were coming back. "Caleb," she said. "Yeah." He said to tell them she stays. A long pause. "I heard him," Caleb said. "I know you heard him. I'm just—" She stopped, tried again. "I want you to know that whatever the court decides, whatever happens in March, I'm not going anywhere. Even if the injunction doesn't hold. Even if my father's lawyers—" She stopped again. Her voice had done something she hadn't intended. She steadied it. "I'm not going anywhere." Caleb was quiet for a long time after that. Then he said, "I know." 2 words. Just 2. But the way he said them, without the carefulness, without the control he usually applied to everything, made her understand that something had shifted. Not everything. Not cleanly. Not the way shifts happen in stories where one moment of honesty untangles 4 years of damage, but something real and imperfect and worth holding on to. They drove into Coldwater Creek in the dark, and through May Sutton's window they could see a lamp burning and a small figure on the bench inside who should have been asleep 2 hours ago, sitting with absolute alert patience, waiting for the sound of wheels on the road. He heard them. She saw him go still for a second, listening. And then he was off the bench and she could hear, even from outside, even through the walls, the sound of his feet on May's floor, running for the door. Caleb pulled the horses up and set the brake and stepped down, and Noah came off May's porch and crossed the distance between them at the full run of a child who has been waiting and has finally run out of patience for waiting, and Caleb caught him and lifted him in one motion, the practiced ease of someone who has done this 1,000 times. And Noah grabbed his father's collar with both hands and said, breathless, "Did you tell them?" "We told them," Caleb said. Noah pulled back to look at his father's face. Checking. Children were brutally accurate lie detectors when the subject concerned them directly. Whatever he found in Caleb's face satisfied him. He looked over his father's shoulder at Evelyn, still on the buckboard, watching the two of them in the lamplight from May's window. "She stays?" he asked. Caleb looked at Evelyn over his son's head. In his face was everything he hadn't said yet, and might not say for a long time, and might eventually say imperfectly and at the wrong moment in the wrong words, which was, she had come to understand, exactly how real things got said. "She stays," Caleb said. Noah's face broke open into the widest thing she'd seen on it yet, and he twisted in his father's arms to reach for her, both hands out, and she stepped down from the buckboard into the cold Montana night and took her son's hands in both of hers, and May appeared in her doorway with a lamp and the expression of a woman who had been pretty sure how this was going to end and was satisfied to be right. The stars above them were the particular extravagance of a cold, clear night far from any city, more stars than you could look at directly, the kind that made the sky feel like a thing that went on past any reasonable measurement. None of it was resolved. The March hearing was weeks away. Arthur Briggs was old and might not make the trip. Her father's lawyers were in Denver doing things she couldn't see. Caleb's loan was still uncertain. The ranch was still struggling. All of it remained. But Noah's hands were cold and small and gripping hers like she was something solid. And behind her, the buckboard horses were stamping and ready for their stalls. And above them, the stars were doing what they'd always done, indifferent and magnificent and so numerous, they made human troubles feel both smaller and somehow more worth having. She held on. The weeks between the preliminary injunction and the March 18th hearing had a quality of suspension to them, like the moment between lightning and thunder when you're counting the distance and not sure if it's close enough to run from. Evelyn counted everything in those weeks. She counted the days on the kitchen calendar, the small squares filling up with X's she made each morning before anyone else was down. She counted the letters that arrived, 2 more from her father's attorneys, each one more precisely worded than the last, each one finding a new angle on the same pressure. She counted the responses Holt drafted, careful and measured, parrying without committing, buying time with the procedural vocabulary of a man who understood that time itself was a form of protection. What she tried not to count was the ways things could still go wrong. Arthur Briggs was the central uncertainty. Holt's contact in Denver had confirmed that Briggs was willing to travel to Billings for the March hearing, but willing and able were different calculations for a 71-year-old man in a boarding house in February. A cold that went to his chest, a fall on icy steps, any number of ordinary things that happen to old bodies in winter could remove the one witness whose testimony made the difference between a strong case and a collection of suggestive paperwork. She wrote to him herself. She'd asked Holt if that was advisable, and Holt had thought about it for a moment and said it probably didn't hurt. She spent an evening on it, at the kitchen table after Noah was in bed, going through 4 drafts before she had something that said what she meant without saying too much. That she remembered his kindness, that she understood what the unlocked window had cost him, that she was not asking him to do anything he hadn't already decided to do, but that she wanted him to know it mattered, that he mattered. She sealed it and sent it with the next day's postwriter and did not let herself think about whether it would reach him. The loan came through in the first week of March. Caleb told her at breakfast, setting the bank letter on the table between them without comment, and she read it and looked up at him, and he was watching her with the expression he used when he was trying not to look like he was waiting for something. Gerald Ashby approved it, she said. Different loan officer, Caleb said. Apparently Ashby moved his attention to some other matters. He poured coffee. Holt thinks Cole's injunction rattled Ashby. Man doesn't want to be connected to something a judge is already looking at. My father will find another way to pressure him, Evelyn said. Maybe, but not before March 18th. He sat down. And after March 18th, we'll know what we have, she said. He nodded, picked up his coffee. Something in his posture was different, had been different since Billings, since she stays. Not relaxed exactly. Caleb Whitmore was not a man who relaxed. That seemed to have been trained or circumstanced out of him years back, but less braced. Like a man who has been walking into a headwind for a long time, and the wind has shifted a few degrees. Noah came down and saw the bank letter on the table and asked if it was more important paperwork. Yes, Caleb said. Is it good important or bad important? Good, Caleb said. Noah accepted this with a nod and climbed into his chair and reached for the bread. And the morning went on the way mornings did. Practical and ordinary and full of small demands. And underneath all of it, Evelyn felt the March hearing waiting like a held breath. On the 9th of March, 9 days before the hearing, a man arrived at the Broken Bow spread in a hired carriage. He was not one of her father's lawyers. She knew her father's lawyers, knew the type. Careful men with careful clothes and the specific blankness of people paid to represent someone else's position rather than their own. This man was different. He was perhaps 40, well-dressed, but not expensively, with the look of someone who did his own work with his own hands and had always done so. He asked for Evelyn Hartley by name at the gate, not for Caleb, and when Caleb came out to meet him instead, the man handed him a card. Caleb brought the card inside to Evelyn. The name on it was Thomas R. Selden. Below the name, Attorney at Law, Helena, Montana. Family Law and Estate Matters. Did he say who sent him? Evelyn asked. He said he has information regarding Clarence Hartley's current legal activities that he believes you need to see. Caleb looked at the card. He's waiting at the gate. She looked at the card for a moment. Everything in her said to be careful. Her father had used intermediaries before, had sent people who seemed to be helping her toward traps she didn't see until she was already in them. "Ask him who told him to come," she said. Caleb went back out. Came back in 2 minutes later. He said, "Arthur Briggs." She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. Thomas Selden sat at Caleb's table with his hat in his hands and spoke with the directness of a man who has something important to say and intends to say it without decoration. He had been Arthur Briggs's personal attorney for 6 years. 3 weeks ago, Briggs had contacted him with specific instructions that if anything prevented Briggs from reaching Billings by March 15th, Selden was to deliver certain documents to Evelyn Hartley personally. He had also, separately, asked Selden to tell Evelyn certain things that he felt she needed to know about her father's current situation. "Is Arthur all right?" Evelyn asked. "He's had a chest cold," Selden said. "He's recovering. His doctor believes he'll be fit to travel by the 14th, which gives him enough time. But he wanted this information in your hands regardless, as a precaution." He opened his case and produced a packet of documents. Not copies, originals. She could see immediately that these were different from what she'd been working with. These were not Briggs's personal observations or copied letters. These were records. Selden laid them out on the table methodically. The first was a series of financial records showing payments made by Clarence Hartley's firm to 3 individuals in the period between 1887 and 1891. One of the names she didn't know. One was the clerk at the Colorado County Records Office who had processed the abandonment filing. The third was a man named Delbert Crane, who worked as a document preparer in Denver. These payments, Selden said, were recorded by Briggs in a private ledger he maintained separately from Hartley's official accounts. He kept this ledger for over 20 years. He has given me permission to present it as evidence. Caleb leaned forward slightly. "What does the ledger prove?" "In combination with the affidavit already in your attorney's possession," Selden said, "it establishes a pattern. It shows that the preparation and filing of the fraudulent abandonment document was not an isolated act. It was part of a broader practice of using paid intermediaries to manipulate legal processes. Which means," he looked at Evelyn, "that your father's Colorado guardianship filing, the one made after you left, was likely prepared by the same method." Evelyn looked at the ledger records. At the careful numbers written in Arthur Briggs's old man's hand, maintained over 2 decades with the precision of someone who understood that someday these numbers might matter. "He kept this the whole time," she said. "The whole time," Selden confirmed. "He told me he started the ledger the first year he understood what Hartley was doing. He said he didn't know if he'd ever be able to use it, but he kept it." Selden paused. "He told me to tell you, he said you would understand that there were more windows than the one on the second floor." Evelyn's breath caught. She understood. Every record, every number, every carefully noted payment. An old man spending 20 years unlocking windows, never knowing which one she'd finally climb through. "Tell him," she said, and her voice only fractured slightly at the edges. "Tell him I found them." She brought everything to Holt that afternoon, all of it. Selden's documents, the ledger records, the explanation of Delbert Crane, and the records clerk and the payment pattern that linked them to her father's method of operation going back decades. Holt read it all. He read it twice. He set it down and took off his spectacles and rubbed the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers in the gesture she had come to recognize as his version of contained excitement. "This changes the shape of the hearing," he said, "significantly." "How?" Caleb asked. "Before today, we were arguing that a specific document was fraudulently prepared in order to deprive a mother of her child. That's a serious matter, but it's a contained one. It's about Evelyn and Noah specifically." Holt tapped the ledger. "This establishes that Hartley has been systematically corrupting legal processes in Colorado for over 20 years. That is not a contained matter. That is something a Colorado court would be extremely interested in, separate from this case entirely." He looked at Evelyn. "Your father's ability to operate in Colorado depends entirely on his reputation with the legal establishment there. If this ledger becomes part of the public record, he can't bury it," Evelyn said, "because it comes from Briggs. And Briggs is the one who kept it, so he's also the one who can explain every entry in it." Exactly, Holt said. "He can discredit one letter. He can argue about one date on one document. He cannot explain away 20 years of payments to intermediaries in his own former clerk's handwriting." The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Cole needs to see this before the 18th, Caleb said. I'll send a courier to Billings today, Holt said. He looked at Evelyn. And I need you to write down everything Selden told you. Everything. Today, while it's exact in your mind. She wrote for 2 hours at Holt's desk while Caleb waited in the chair by the window, and Holt prepared his courier materials. And when she was done, her hand ached, and she had 4 pages of close-written notes that covered everything from the names in the ledger to what Selden had said about Briggs's chest cold to the exact phrasing of the message Briggs had sent her through Selden's voice. She looked at those 4 pages when she was done. She thought about her father at his breakfast table in Denver, cutting his eggs. Unaware, probably still, of exactly what Arthur Briggs had been building in his private ledger for 20 years. Certain, probably, that the woman who had climbed out of his window was running scared and running out of resources and could be pressured back into silence the way she'd always been pressured before. She thought, he made one mistake. He had been so certain she would never find the right people, the right attorney, the right judge. He had operated for so long in a world where his money and his contacts determined what was possible that it had never occurred to him. She might find corners of that world where his money didn't reach as far. Coldwater Creek, Montana, 9 miles northeast. A man with repaired gloves and a boy who whistled and an old lawyer with wire spectacles. He hadn't seen any of that coming. Bossum. 2 days before the hearing, Caleb drove her to the south fence line because 3 posts had heaved in the last freeze and needed resetting before the spring thaw made it worse. They worked through the morning, methodical and mostly quiet, trading the tools back and forth with the ease of people who have done physical work together long enough to have a rhythm. At midday, they stopped and ate from the lunch she'd packed, cornbread and cold pork, and the last of the dried apples from the barrel in the cellar, and sat on the buckboard bench with the open ground all around them and the sky doing its Montana thing, enormous and unmarked. What happens if it goes wrong? She asked. The hearing, if there's something we didn't anticipate. Caleb chewed, looked at the horizon. Then we figure out the next thing, he said. There might not be a next thing, she said. If my father gets a Colorado court to enforce the guardianship and Cole can't stop it, then we go to Colorado, he said, and we find whoever we need to find there. He said it flatly, like a man stating a practical fact. I'm not going to tell you everything works out. I don't know that, but I know I'm not going to be the reason we stop before we've tried every direction. She looked at him. At the sight of his face, the jaw she'd memorized years ago and relearned in the past weeks, the same lines, different hardness. You didn't have to do any of this, she said. When I showed up, you had every reason to send me away. You still have. Noah asked me this morning if you're going to be his mother forever, Caleb said. She stopped. What did you tell him? She asked, after a moment. I told him that was a big question. He looked at her then, directly, which he didn't always do. He said he already knew the answer. He just wanted to know if I did. The wind came off the open ground and moved through the dry grass along the fence line and went on. Do you? She asked. A long pause. Not the kind where someone is deciding whether to be honest. The kind where someone is deciding how to be honest without either promising too much or shutting down something that is, finally, cautiously, starting to breathe. I know what I don't want, he said. I don't want to still be angry in another 4 years. I've been angry for 4 years, and it costs something, being that angry. It costs more than I thought it did when I thought it was keeping me functional. He turned back to the horizon. I don't know the rest yet, but I know that. That's enough, she said. For now, that's enough. You keep saying that, he said. Because I keep meaning it, she said. He looked at her again, briefer this time, and the ghost of the not-quite smile moved across his face and was gone. Finish your cornbread, he said. We've got 4 more posts. Arthur Briggs arrived in Billings on March 16th, 2 days before the hearing, delivered there by Selden in a hired coach with enough blankets to stock a small hotel. Holt telegraphed the news to Coldwater Creek, and Evelyn read it standing in the kitchen and allowed herself for 30 seconds to close her eyes and just breathe. Then she went back to packing for the trip. May arrived the morning of the 17th to stay with Noah. She came with the tin of molasses cookies and a look that said she had been tracking the situation carefully and was satisfied with the trajectory so far, but was reserving full judgment for outcomes. When, she said to Evelyn while Caleb loaded the buckboard. I intend to. Evelyn said. Good. May looked at her for a moment with those sharp, engraving eyes. When all this is settled, however it settles, what are you planning to do? The question was larger than its words. Evelyn understood that. Stay, she said. If that's still... She glanced toward Caleb at the buckboard. If I can. May followed her glance and made a small sound that contained a large amount of opinion about what she was seeing. You can, she said. Noah appeared on the porch in his coat and hat, clearly intending to deliver some final important information before they left. I've been thinking, he announced. About what? Evelyn asked. About what to call you, he said. I've been thinking about it for a while. She waited. I think I'm going to call you Mama, he said, because that's what you are. He said it with the specific matter-of-fact certainty that he brought to conclusions he'd fully worked out before stating them. Even while you're gone, that's still what you'll be. She crouched down to his level. She had gotten better at not crying in front of him. She was not perfect at it. That's what I'll be, she said. He patted her cheek in the way he had, the deliberate assessing pat of a person checking that something is real and solid and where it's supposed to be. Okay, he said, satisfied, and went back inside to May. The March 18th hearing was not a drama. That was the thing about real legal proceedings that no account of them quite captured. They were slow and technical, and required patience of a kind that had nothing cinematic about it. Cole sat at the bench with the demeanor of a man who had seen a great many things and was not going to be hurried through any of them. Holt presented the case in the measured, precise way he did everything. The original fraudulent filing, the date discrepancy, the letters, Briggs's affidavit, the ledger, Selden's documentation of the payment pattern. Arthur Briggs sat in a chair to the left of the main table because he could not stand for long periods. He was smaller than Evelyn had imagined him. She'd built him up in her memory to a larger scale than the reality, which was a thin old man with age spots on his hands, and the kind of stillness that comes from having made a decision and being at peace with it. When Cole asked him questions, he answered them clearly and without hesitation. He was not theatrical. He did not seek sympathy. He stated facts with the precision of a man who had been keeping records for 20 years and knew exactly what each record meant and why it mattered. At one point, Cole asked him directly, "Why did you maintain this ledger? You were employed by Hartley. You had every incentive to protect him." Briggs looked at his hands for a moment, then he looked up. "Miss Evelyn was 11 days old when I first saw her," he said. "I watched that man control everything about her life from that day forward. I wasn't brave enough to stop it, but I decided I would be honest enough to record it." He paused. "A man has to decide what kind of man he is. I decided late, but I decided." Cole wrote something. He wrote for a long time. The attorney representing Hartley's interests, sent from Denver, a smooth man who'd been trying to find purchase on the case all morning and finding very little, raised procedural objections to the ledger's admissibility. Cole listened to all of them and overruled them in the same measured tone. Then he looked at Evelyn. "Ms. Hartley," he said, "you have anything to add?" She had prepared something. 3 days ago, she would have delivered it exactly as prepared. But she looked at Briggs's hands on the table and thought about 20 years of unlocked windows, and she set aside what she'd prepared. "My father is a man who decided that control was the same as care," she said. "He convinced himself that what he did to me, to my son, to the people who worked for him, he convinced himself it was management, organization, that people needed to be arranged into positions that served his plan." She looked at Cole. "I'm not asking this court to punish him for being wrong about that. I'm asking it to establish that the legal documents he used to enforce that control are fraudulent, that my son was never legally removed from my care through any honest process, that Noah Whitmore is my son, and I am his mother, and no paper my father filed or paid to have filed changes that fact." Cole looked at her for a moment. "I'm also asking," she said, because she had started and might as well finish, "that this court notify the Colorado Bar Association of the documentation before them. Not because I want to destroy my father, because what Briggs's ledger shows is a pattern, and other people may have been affected by that pattern who deserve to know it existed." Cole looked at Holt. "Is that a formal motion?" "It can be," Holt said. "Make it formal," Cole said. But the ruling came at 4:17 in the afternoon. Cole voided the Colorado abandonment filing of 1888 on the grounds of documented fraud. He found the subsequent Colorado guardianship filing invalid on the same grounds, and in light of the broader pattern of document manipulation established by Briggs's ledger. He referred the ledger to the Colorado Bar Association for independent review of potential misconduct affecting other parties. He awarded primary legal guardianship of Noah Whitmore to his mother, Evelyn Hartley, effective immediately. And then he looked at Caleb, who had been sitting quietly at the table throughout the entire proceeding. "You want to say something, Mr. Whitmore?" he asked. Caleb looked mildly surprised to be addressed. "No, sir," he said. "Everything that needed saying got said." Cole almost smiled. "Good," he said, and gathered his papers, and that was that. They were on the road back to Coldwater Creek before the sun reached the horizon, and the gold light came at a flat angle across the open ground and lit the frozen grass along the fence lines, and Evelyn sat on the buckboard bench with Holt asleep in the back again, an achievement that she was beginning to think was a deliberate strategy on his part, and she looked at the light on the grass and tried to understand that it was over. Not over. Not fully. Her father would respond to the Colorado Bar referral with his full resources, and that would be its own long process, and there would be lawyers and letters and pressures she hadn't anticipated yet. The loan still had to be paid back. The ranch still had 3 head less than it should. Spring was coming, and spring on a ranch was its own brand of relentless. But this was over. The specific thing that had kept her awake at night since she climbed out that window, the question of whether she would ever have a legal claim to her own son, that was over. "You're not saying anything," Caleb said. "I'm thinking," she said. "About what?" She looked at the light on the grass, at the enormous sky, at the road ahead that led back to a ranch house with a cot in the spare room and a paper crane on the shelf and a wooden horse that someone had carved and not quite finished. "About Noah," she said. "About what I'm going to tell him." "Tell him the paperwork came through," Caleb said. "He doesn't need the legal details. He just needs to know it's done." "He'll want details," she said. "He always wants details." "Then give him the ones that matter," Caleb said. "That his mother is his mother, officially, that nobody can change it." He paused. "He'll understand that." She looked at Caleb's profile in the last light. "You could have testified against me," she said. It had occurred to her somewhere in the middle of Cole's questions that Caleb had been sitting at that table, and Cole had given him the opportunity to speak, and he hadn't, but he could have. He could have said any number of things that would have complicated the case. "You had reason to." "I had reason to 4 years ago," he said, "before I knew what actually happened." He kept his eyes on the road. Man who stays angry when the reason for it turns out to be a lie isn't angry anymore. He's just stubborn. She looked at him. "Are you stubborn?" she asked. "Yes," he said, "but I'm working on it." She looked back at the road. The light was going now, the gold pulling back toward the horizon, the sky deepening above it. "Caleb," she said, "yeah. When we get back, after we tell Noah, after things settle." She stopped, found the words. "I'd like to talk about what comes next, for us. Not for the legal situation or the ranch or Noah specifically, for us." A silence. The horse's hooves on the frozen road, Holt breathing steadily in the back. "All right," Caleb said. "We'll talk." Not yes yet. Not a promise or a declaration. Just we'll talk. Which was, she had learned, where everything real between them had started, with a decision to say the thing out loud and see what happened to it in the air between two people who had hurt each other, even if only one of them had done it knowingly. She looked at the last of the light. She thought about Noah at May's kitchen table, probably long past the hour he should have gone to bed, waiting with the absolute certainty of a child who has decided what the answer is and simply needs the adults to catch up to it. She thought about this paper crane on the shelf, and the carving of the horse that nobody had finished, and the pair of gloves repaired at the thumb, and the boot left on the floor with the lace undone. Small things. The accumulation of small things that is in the end what a life is made of. The road curved northeast toward Coldwater Creek, toward the lights that would show in May's window when they got close enough to see them. Evelyn looked at those lights beginning to appear in the dark, and she felt, for the first time in 4 years, the specific sensation of moving towards something rather than away from it. It was imperfect, and it was unfinished, and it had about 30 things that could still go sideways before it became anything she'd call secure. But it was hers. All of it, finally and terrifyingly and completely, was hers. Noah was still awake when they got back. May had tried, apparently, and then given up trying sometime around 9 o'clock, when it became clear that Noah Whitmore had made a categorical decision not to sleep until he had confirmation of what he already believed to be true. He was sitting at May's kitchen table with a piece of charcoal and a sheet of paper and the particular alertness of a child running on stubbornness alone. And when the buckboard pulled up outside, he was off his chair before the horses fully stopped. He came through the door at a run and stopped in the middle of the kitchen floor and looked at Evelyn's face the way he always looked at things he was trying to understand. Directly, seriously, without the social softening that adults learn to apply to their scrutiny. Whatever he found there answered his question before she could speak. He crossed the remaining distance between them and put his arms around her waist and pressed his face against her coat. And didn't say anything, which was unusual enough for him that it told her more than words would have. She held him. She put her hand on the back of his head, his hair still needing the cut it had been needing for 3 weeks, and she held him and breathed and let the fact of it settle. "The paperwork came through," she said, against the top of his head. "It's done." A pause. His voice came out muffled against her coat. "I'm officially yours?" "You were always mine," she said. "Now it says so on paper." He pulled back enough to look at her face. His eyes were bright, and she could see him deciding not to cry with the same effort she applied to the same decision, the family resemblance in that moment so clear it almost hurt. "Okay," he said. The word came out unsteady. He straightened his spine and tried again. "Okay." Steadier. Caleb had come in behind her. Noah looked at his father over her shoulder. "Did you tell them?" he asked. Same question he'd asked in Billings. His one consistent measure of whether the world was doing what it should. "We told them," Caleb said. Same answer. Meaning it more this time. Noah nodded once, the nod of a person who has been waiting for the adults to confirm what he already knew, and then he turned to May, who was standing by the stove with her arms folded and an expression that was working very hard not to be what it was. "I told you," he said to her. "You did," May said. "I should have listened." "You should have," he agreed without heat, and went to get his coat from the hook by the door because he was clearly ready to go home. Spring came to the Broken Bow. The way spring came to most of Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in fits and arguments. A warm week followed by a freeze, followed by mud, followed by a morning so clear and bright it seemed like an apology for everything that came before. The fence line that had heaved through winter needed resetting. The cattle the loan had allowed Caleb to buy, 6 head of decent stock from a seller in Billings, needed to be integrated into the existing small herd. There was a section of barn roof that had not survived a heavy snow in February and required rebuilding. Evelyn learned to use a hammer that spring. Not well, not quickly. Her first week of it produced crooked nails and bruised fingers, and one afternoon where she hit her thumb hard enough that she said something she was glad Noah wasn't within earshot of. Caleb watched her the first time and didn't offer to take over, which she appreciated, and didn't comment on the crooked nails, which she also appreciated. "You're gripping it too far up," he said, after the 3rd bent nail. "I know," she said, "so grip it lower." "I'm aware of the theory," she said. He almost laughed. Almost. The ghost thing, more substantial than it used to be, there for a full second before it went. She gripped it lower. The next nail went in straight. She looked at it for a moment. "There," he said, and went back to his section of roof. They worked through the morning in the particular silence she had come to think of as comfortable, full of small sounds, the hammer and the wind and the cattle in the near pasture, but empty of the need to fill space with words. She had lived in houses where silence was something to be afraid of, where it meant someone was angry or preparing to be angry. This was different. This was the silence of 2 people who had enough to do and trusted each other to do it. She had not always trusted it. For weeks after the hearing, she'd kept waiting for it to crack, for some version of what had always happened before. The control reestablishing itself, the cost of the warmth turning out to be higher than she'd anticipated. But March became April and nothing cracked. Things broke and got fixed. New problems arrived and got worked on. The ordinary difficulty of a working ranch in the high plains continued to present itself with total indifference to whether the people managing it had recently resolved a legal crisis. And that indifference, she had come to understand, was itself a kind of freedom. Nobody was managing her. Nobody was watching to see if she was performing her role correctly. She was just a person who needed to fix this section of fence today and figure out the household accounts tomorrow. And remember to check on the red cow whose digestion had been unreliable since winter. It was the most ordinary thing she had ever done. It was the most extraordinary she had ever felt. The letter from the Colorado Bar Association arrived in late April, addressed to Asa Holt, who sent word to the ranch. Holt read it to them in his office with the wire spectacles and the measured voice, and the summary of it was this. The Bar Association had reviewed Briggs's ledger in full. They had opened formal proceedings against 2 attorneys who had participated in the preparation of the fraudulent documents. They had forwarded the matter of the falsified county filing to the district attorney's office in Denver, and they had notified Clarence Hartley, in writing, that he was the subject of a formal ethics investigation. Holt set the letter down. "That won't put him in prison," Evelyn said. She said it without bitterness, just as a statement of fact. She had learned long ago not to want things from the law that the law wasn't structured to give. "No," Holt agreed. "Probably not. But the investigation becomes part of the public record. Anyone who does business with him, anyone who relies on his legal standing, they'll know it exists." "He'll lose influence," Caleb said. "Some. Among people who care about that kind of thing." Holt looked at Evelyn. "His ability to reach into Montana legal proceedings on your behalf is substantially reduced. Not eliminated, but reduced." She thought about her father at his breakfast table. She tried to feel something large about it. Triumph, satisfaction, the specific relief of a person who has won. What she actually felt was smaller and quieter. Not nothing. But not what she'd imagined feeling when she'd thought about this moment on the train coming north, on the night she'd stared at the ceiling in the spare room of the Broken Bow. "Good," she said. "That's enough." Holt looked at her. "You're not—" He stopped. "What?" she asked. "I expected you to feel more about it," he said. Honesty from Holt was always slightly surprising because it didn't match his careful professional presentation, and she appreciated it every time. "I feel what I feel," she said, "which is that I'd like to go home and tell Noah the roof is almost finished and see if Caleb wants help with the evening feeding." She paused. "The rest of it, my father's problems are his problems now. That's new for me. I think I'm going to take a while to get used to it." Holt looked at her for a moment, then at Caleb. "She's going to be fine," he said to Caleb, like she wasn't in the room. "I know," Caleb said, like it had never been in question, which was either deeply presumptuous or, she thought, the most straightforward thing he'd said about her to another person in the months she'd known him again. She decided it was the second one. The conversation she had told Caleb she wanted to have, about what came next for them, for themselves, separate from Noah and the ranch and the legal situation, happened in late May on a Tuesday evening, which was not a remarkable day in any other respect. They had been sitting on the porch after supper, which had become a habit without either of them deciding it should. Noah had gone to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in weeks, tired out from a day that had involved, in sequence, helping with the new cattle, discovering a bird's nest in the fence post, attempting to teach the barn cat a series of skills it had no interest in acquiring, and finally asking Evelyn to read to him, which she did for 40 minutes until his eyes stopped fighting her and closed. She came out to the porch and sat down. The night was warm enough to be comfortable, cold enough to remind you where you were. The stars were doing their extravagant thing. "I want to stay," she said. Not a preamble, just that. Caleb was looking at the dark outline of the near pasture. "I know," he said. "I want to stay not because of Noah, or not only because of Noah. I want to stay because—" She stopped, tried to find the honest version, and not the careful version. "Because I'm useful here, and because I'm better here than I've been anywhere." She looked at her hands on her knees. "And because I love you. I never stopped, and I know that's a complicated thing to say after everything, and I'm not asking you to say it back or to do anything about it right now. I wanted it to be said, out loud. So it's in the air instead of just in my head." The silence that followed was not the comfortable working silence. It was the other kind. the kind with weight and direction. Caleb was quiet for long enough that she started to prepare herself for some version of "I don't know yet," which was honest, and which she could live with, which she had been living with. "I was angry at you for 4 years," he said. "I built a whole version of you in my head that was, she was the woman who left, who chose to leave, who decided Noah and I weren't worth staying for." He turned the coffee cup in his hands, a habit she'd catalogued alongside the jaw working and the too even voice. "When you showed up here, I thought I was going to find out that version was right, that you'd come back because you needed something, and the version in my head was accurate." "Was it?" she asked. "No," he said, "which I knew by about the second week." He looked at the pasture. "Which made me angrier, actually, for a while. Because it meant the 4 years of anger was misdirected," she said. "Because it meant I'd been alone for 4 years for a reason that wasn't real," he said. "That's a different thing from misdirected." She understood the difference. "I'm sorry," she said, "for what it cost you, for what you went through not knowing, for what Noah went through. I know I didn't choose it, but I'm still sorry for the cost of it." He looked at her then. The direct look, the one he used when he had decided to stop managing what showed on his face. "I know you didn't choose it," he said. "I know that, I believe it. I told you I was working on it, and I did the work." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't think the love went anywhere either," he said. "I think I buried it under the anger because that was how I got through it. But it was there." He looked back at the pasture. "It's still there." She let that sit in the air between them for a moment. Let it be what it was without moving to manage it. "That's enough," she said softly. "You keep saying that," he said. "I keep meaning it," she said. He looked at her. The ghost smile this time became the thing itself. Brief, imperfect, entirely real. "I know," he said. They sat on the porch in the warm May night, and the stars did their work above them, and neither of them said anything else for a long time, which was not an absence of conversation, but the continuation of one. They married in September, which was May Sutton's suggestion, and turned out to be correct. September in that part of Montana was the best the weather got, past the brutal heat of July, before the cold came back with its serious intentions, a stretch of days that were bright and cool and smelled like grass and distance. It was not a large event. It was also not a small one. The people of Coldwater Creek, who had watched the whole of this unfold from varying distances and with varying degrees of skepticism, turned out in numbers that surprised Evelyn. She had not thought of herself as someone with a community here, had thought of herself for most of the past 8 months as a person in the process of earning a right to belong. But May had apparently been quietly at work on a different understanding, and the evidence of that work showed up in the form of people she knew only slightly bringing food and goodwill and the particular warmth of a frontier community that has decided someone belongs. Hector Muniz, who had driven her out to the ranch in January with the silent understanding of a man who gives people the benefit of the doubt, was there. The man from the train station, who had looked at her with suspicion that first night, was there too, and shook her hand afterward with the expression of a person revising a previous assessment and doing it without complaint. Gerald Ashby was not there. Nobody seemed to notice his absence. The ceremony was simple, which was what they both wanted. Noah stood beside his father with his hair combed for the occasion and a collar that he found objectionable but endured without complaint, and when it was done, he took both their hands, Caleb's on one side, Evelyn's on the other, and walked between them back through the gathered people with the satisfied air of someone whose prediction has been confirmed. May cried. She did it while looking in the opposite direction, as if by not facing anyone she could maintain plausible deniability about the crying. Evelyn didn't cry. She had cried at enough points in the preceding 8 months to feel she had covered the available ground, and what she felt today was past the point where crying was the right expression of it. It was quieter than that, more like the feeling of setting something down that you've been carrying for so long you forgot it had a weight. Arthur Briggs died in November of that year. Selden wrote to tell them, and Selden's letter said that Briggs had been in good spirits in the final months, that he had read Evelyn's letter more than once, that he had expressed satisfaction about how things had resolved. He had died in his sleep in the boarding house on the south side of Denver, which was, Selden wrote, the kind of ending a man who had spent his life in someone else's service probably deserved, quiet and his own. Evelyn sat with that letter for a long time. She thought about what it meant to do the right thing too late and to know it, and to do it anyway from the position of too late rather than using the lateness as a reason not to act. She thought about 20 years of a private ledger, about a filing date altered by one man with limited power doing the most he could within the constraints of the position he was trapped in. She had thought about it before. She thought about it differently now. Not with grief exactly, though there was grief in it, but with the specific gratitude that comes when you understand how many small acts of quiet courage it took to get you to where you are. Arthur Briggs had not saved her. She had saved herself, or as much as any person saves themselves, which is always partial, always in combination with other people, and a certain amount of luck and the willingness to climb out the window when the window is open. But he had left the window open. That mattered. That was a thing you did not forget. She wrote to Selden asking where Briggs was buried. She intended to visit someday when they had the means to make the trip, and to leave something there. Not flowers, which felt too formal, but something small and considered. She hadn't decided what yet. The following spring, a woman appeared at the gate of the Broken Bow spread on a cold April morning, carrying one bag, wearing a coat that wasn't warm enough for the weather, with the particular expression of someone who has come a long distance for a reason they aren't sure they can explain to a stranger. Evelyn saw her from the kitchen window. She recognized, with a precision that had nothing to do with having seen this woman before, exactly what she was looking at. She put on her coat and walked out to the gate. The woman's name was Clara. She was younger than Evelyn had been, 20 maybe, with a child's face that had been asked to carry adult weight too quickly. She said she had heard there was a woman out here who had gone to court about something like— She paused, trying to find the right words. Something like what Clara's husband's family was doing to her. Trying to take her son. She said she had come from over in Havre, which was considerable distance, and she was sorry to just arrive like this. She knew it was an imposition. Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "It's not an imposition," she said. "Come inside, I'll put coffee on." Clara hesitated at the gate the way Evelyn had once hesitated at May's door. The hesitation of someone who has been turned away enough times to expect it, even when it isn't coming. "You don't know anything about me?" Clara said. "No," Evelyn said, "but I know what a woman looks like who's been carrying something for too long." She held the gate open. "Come in." Clara came in. That was how it started, not with a plan or an intention, but with a gate held open and coffee put on and an hour of listening to a young woman explain a situation that had its own specific details and its own specific anguish, and that also, underneath all of that, had the same shape as every other situation where someone with power decided they had the right to arrange other people's lives without their consent. Evelyn didn't solve it that day. Nobody's problem gets solved in a day. What she did was write down the details, draft a letter to Holt, and send it with the next postwriter. And when Holt wrote back with questions, she answered them. And when he identified a legal avenue, she explained it to Clara. And when Clara was afraid, she told her the truth, which was that fear was correct and reasonable, and also not sufficient reason to stop. "I was afraid the entire time," Evelyn told her. "I was afraid when I climbed out the window. I was afraid when I got off the train. I was afraid every day for months while the legal process did what legal processes do, which is take longer than you want and move in directions you don't expect." She looked at Clara. "Being afraid doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It just means you understand the stakes." Clara looked at her. "How did you stop being afraid?" Evelyn thought about that honestly. "I didn't, entirely," she said. "I just got less interested in waiting until I wasn't afraid to do the things that needed doing." She paused. "And I found people who helped. You can't do it alone. Nobody does it alone." Clara stayed for 3 days. She went back to Havre with Holt's letter and a list of steps and the address of a woman in Billings, who Holt believed could provide additional guidance on her specific situation. She went back less alone than she'd arrived, which was not the same as safe, but was a start. Evelyn watched her go from the gate. Caleb came to stand beside her. "Holt's going to be busy," he said. "Yes," she said. He looked at her. "You're going to keep doing this?" It wasn't a question. She answered it anyway. "If I can be useful," she said. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "We should probably add a proper room off the east side of the house. If people are going to be staying—" She looked at him. "You're not going to argue with me about it," she said. "No," he said. "Why not?" He looked at the road where Clara's borrowed wagon had gone, and then at the ranch the repaired barn roof, the new fence post set straight, the cattle in the near pasture, the kitchen window where Noah's face appeared briefly, checking to see why his parents were standing at the gate instead of coming inside. "Because I watched what it cost you not to be able to help yourself," he said. "The least I can do is not get in your way when you're helping someone else." She looked at him for a long moment. There were things she could have said. Several of them were true and meaningful and deserved to be said eventually. But the moment was not hungry for words. The moment was already full of what it needed. The road still holding Clara's wagon tracks in the spring mud, Noah's face in the window, the ordinary morning of a working ranch continuing around them. She took Caleb's hand. He closed his fingers around hers. They went inside. This is what Evelyn Hartley understood, by the end of it, that she had not understood at the beginning. That the people who take your choices away are always, at their core, afraid of what you would choose. Her father's control was not confidence, it was the opposite. A man who trusts the people in his life does not need to arrange them. He needs to arrange them precisely because he cannot trust that they would stay, that they would love him, that they would choose him. And so he removes the choice and calls it care. The tragedy of men like her father is not what they do. It's what they spend their lives making impossible. Every locked door is also a door they cannot walk through themselves. She had spent years believing the problem was her, that she had been too weak, too slow, too afraid to save herself sooner. She understood now that this was also something he had arranged. People who are busy doubting themselves are not busy planning escapes. The window that finally mattered was not Arthur Briggs's unlocked window on the second floor, though she would never stop being grateful for it. The window was the one she had been keeping open in herself, through 4 years of a life she hadn't chosen, the small preserved knowledge that she was still in there, still the person who had named her son and loved the man who fathered him and wanted something different than what she'd been given. She had never let that close, even when it would have been easier to let it close. That was the thing nobody had arranged for her, the thing her father couldn't touch even when he touched everything else. Noah started school the following September in Coldwater Creek, and on his first day he walked in with the serious, deliberate confidence of a child who has decided that new situations are interesting rather than threatening, and his teacher wrote to Evelyn 3 weeks later to say that he was extraordinary, that he asked better questions than most adults, and that he had already organized the other children in his class into a system for deciding whose turn it was to use the good pencils. Evelyn read that letter at the kitchen table and laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere uncomplicated, and handed it to Caleb, who read it and looked at her and said, "He gets it from you," which was not something he would have said 8 months earlier, and the fact that he said it now without calculation, just as a true thing, was itself a measure of how far they had come. Not all the way. You never get all the way. There were still nights when Caleb went somewhere internal that she couldn't follow. Still mornings when the old anger surfaced in him and he worked it off in the barn rather than sitting with it. Still moments between them that caught on old damage like cloth on a nail. That was what it meant to build something after wreckage. The wreckage didn't disappear. It became part of the foundation, and you built on top of it and around it, and sometimes the floor was uneven, but the house stood. She could live in an uneven house. She had lived in worse. The woman who had stepped off a train in January in a torn dress with $7 and one impossible destination had not expected to find what she found. She had not expected the gate to open, or the coffee to be put on, or the boy with the serious dark eyes who called her what she was before she'd earned the right to be called it. She had not expected, most of all, to become someone who held gates open for other people. That was the part that still surprised her sometimes. That the end of surviving was not simply surviving. That what you did with your freedom after you fought for it was its own kind of answer to the people who had tried to take it. Not a revenge. Something quieter and more permanent than revenge. A life. Imperfect, uneven, still being built. Hers.